Good morning. Good morning. We're going to start now. Maybe. Welcome to Bible class. We're going to pick up Ruth chapter 3 today as we continue looking into this book and seeing what God has to say about what love really is. And we'll see that especially today. So let's open with prayer. Gracious God, we praise and thank you for love. We thank you for husbands and wives, parents and children, friends and family. You enrich our lives in so many ways, and all of this points to your love for us. You created us. You created marriage, and you enabled us to have children. It's such a blessing. As we look at Ruth chapter 3 today, we ask that you would help us to understand more truly what love is, because our understanding, our thinking, even our spirit is damaged and warped by sin. We don't get it. We don't understand. We often live selfishly. So help us to learn more today, but not just learning, Lord, transform us by the power of your word and the Spirit working through it. In Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so as we start working through Ruth chapter 3, we're going to look at it a few verses at a time. By and large, I'll have those verses up on the screen, but having a Bible really is a good idea because we're going to be looking at other passages today that won't be up on the screen. So if you're watching this at home online, you want to have your Bible open, and then you can pause the video if you need to look stuff up. All right, so we're going to begin with verses 1 through 4. See if I can get this working. There we go. Okay, so let's read this together. Then Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, "My daughter, should I not seek rest for you, that it may be well with you? Is not Boaz our relative, with whose young women you were? See, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Wash, therefore, and anoint yourself, and put on your cloak, and go down to the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. But when he lies down, observe the place where he lies. Then go, uncover his feet, and lie down, and he will tell you what to do." Okay, so let's take a look at these first 4 verses. Naomi is seeking security, the security of a permanent home for Ruth. So when she uses this word rest, she is not using the Hebrew word Shabbat. We get our word Sabbath from that. It's a completely different word. And so this isn't about, hey, shouldn't I, be thinking of a cozy bungalow with a nice, hammock in there, good pillow, you can sleep in that. That's not what Naomi's talking about. She's saying, you need some security. You need a place to live. You need income you can count on. You need family, all those kinds of things. And so let's take a look at Ruth 1, verse 9, as a passage to kind of go along with that. So if you would look in your Bibles, Ruth 1. Ruth 1:9. And this is the first part of the account where Naomi decides she's heading home, and her daughters-in-law say, "Hey, we're going with you. We're with you all the way, Naomi." And Naomi must have been quite the woman for these young ladies to do this. And so she says, "No, you should go home." And then verse 9, "May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." That's the exact same word. And again, notice what she says, a rest in the home of another husband. It doesn't mean that you're going to, again, have a nice place to take naps, that he's a sofa builder and you'll have a sofa in every room. What she's saying is you'll find security, rest from anxiety, rest from the worry of trying to know when your next meal is going to come from, and so on. Okay? Since returning to Bethlehem, notice now that Naomi is healed enough to be thinking of someone besides herself. This is the first time in the book that Naomi thinks of somebody else, or at least that she expresses that. I'm sure she's probably thinking of other people, but this is the first time in the book. We have to wait till chapter 3 for Naomi to say, "Well, let me do something for you." And so she's healing. And that's a great reminder, isn't it, when you think about grief? Did Naomi have reason for grief? Despair? Absolutely she did. she's moved away from home, her husband dies, and then her sons die. That means she has no economic foundation for the rest of her life. She's going to be one of, I never thought I'd be one of those people. Have you ever seen that on the news? Maybe interviewing someone who's homeless living in Sacramento. And say, I never thought I would be one of those people I watched on TV. And it's really a tragedy. And that's what Naomi has experienced. The good news, though, is that now Naomi has experienced some healing, and she's starting to think about other people. Now, Naomi gives instructions for Ruth. This is what you should do. Wash your face, anoint yourself. So that would be oil. You would do this for parties, too, by the way. In Isaiah chapter, I think it's 25, verses 6 to 9. I might be wrong on the chapter. But anyways, I know it's in Isaiah, where God is talking about what he's going to do for his people, and death will no longer no longer control them. And I believe it's actually Isaiah 61. The Spirit of the Lord is on me. He has anointed me to preach good news to the poor, release for the prisoners, healing for the brokenhearted, and so on. And this says, no longer will they wear ashes, but instead the oil of gladness. So if you were going to a party, today, what would you do to get ready? What would you do to get ready, Mike? Take a shower. Take a shower. Thank you. That's like number one thing, right? So take a shower, right? And then let's say it's the summer, it's 106, and you're taking a shower. What would you need to do then? Deodorant. Thank you. None of the women are going to say that, but the men are. We've been trained. So you take a shower, you put on deodorant. Then, you got to put on some nice clothes and so forth. So in this text, when the text talks about oil here for Ruth, or in that passage in Isaiah, when you go to a party, you didn't have, speed stick that you could wear or a spray deodorant, So what would you do? You would take a little dab of oil, sometimes wax, and the perfumers would have mixed perfume with it. And so you put this little dab of oil in your head, or this wax, and over the course of the party, you're there for 2-3 hours, whatever, because you get warm because you're inside somebody's house. And so that oil would evaporate, or the wax would expand and go all through your hair, and it would give off this wonderful odor, so nobody's doing this around you. Okay? And so Ruth is saying, wash your face, smell nice. And then she says, put your cloak on. Now, if you have an NIV Bible, I typically use the NIV just because I think it's a little more readable. It's in regular English like people talk. The ESV is a little more wooden, but it also follows the translation a little more literally. And neither is worse or better. They're different styles of translation. When people translate Bibles, there's two schools of thought. One is called dynamic equivalence, and that's the NIV and other translations like that. In other words, the translators will say, well, we know what it means in the original Hebrew or Greek, and now we're going to put it in the most understandable language of whatever culture I'm translating for. So it could be North American English, could be British English, could be Spain Spanish or Central American Spanish. We'll put it in just the regular language that people work. And that's nice because pretty much everybody can read it and understand it. Now, the other way of looking at translation, and I always forget the name of this one, but it's more of a linear translation. It's word for word. And so it tries to reproduce the word order of the original Hebrew or Greek. And that is a little harder to understand because we don't think that way anymore. But it's a little more accurate in determining, like, for example, the order of words in a sentence. And so sometimes I'll go back and forth. So here, the NIV, someone have an NIV, what does Naomi tell Ruth to do in terms of clothing?
Put on your best clothes.
Put on your best clothes. That's right. It's not what the text says. The text literally says put on your cloak. Now, I did look at one commentary, and that particular author felt that, well, that means put on your best. I disagree with that. I think Ruth is traveling at night. She's going to put a cloak on. That's why Ruth is saying, like any good mother, put your coat on. Where do you think you're going without a coat? But she does that. But more importantly, I'll get my slide to move forward here. The clothing that Ruth would wear would signify that her time of mourning was over. And so when you mourned in the Bible, what did you put on? sackcloth and ashes, right? And sackcloth, burlap kind of stuff, rough, not comfortable at all. And then ashes would discolor your face. And so that's what you would wear. Remember when Jesus teaches in the Sermon on the Mount? He says, when you pray, when you give, and he also says, when you fast, what does he say? Don't broadcast it. Yeah, don't broadcast it. So he says, so one of the translations says, don't disfigure your faces. Well, obviously someone's not going to take a hammer and hit themselves. What Jesus is saying, don't put a bunch of ashes on your face so everybody knows. When you do fasting, the whole idea is not to say, look at me, I'm so sad, I'm serving the Lord in prayer. That's not the point. The point is to fast and to simply spend time with the Lord in prayer. And so Jesus says, don't let anybody know. He actually says, put oil on your face. Make it look like you're going to a party, but be fasting. So Ruth now is showing, hey, I'm not in this period of mourning anymore. Now, I didn't know quite where to put this, so I just kind of put it at the beginning to give a introduction to the chapter. The language of chapter 3 uses language that avoids the suggestion of immorality, and I kind of wanted to write a whole paragraph, but I didn't. I had mercy on you guys. But it also shows that the possibility was there. Exactly. So there's language that's used in the text, and we'll talk about it later, that you read and go, what does that mean? I wonder. But we'll see in the text that the language used is different than the language, for example, the Canaanite fertility religions. I don't know what they're doing upstairs, but it's big. It's really big. All right, so let's take a look at 5 and 6. Let's read together, please. And she replied, all that you say I will do. So he went down to the threshing floor and did just as her mother-in-law had commanded her. Okay, so a lot of trust is required for Ruth to go and do this, isn't there? Can you imagine? I mean, that's pretty wild. You're a foreigner, so let's say that you moved to Mexico. And just, we'll give it a little bit of context, but let's say your daughter was 14. And you were there for a year, and she turned 15, and all your neighbors said to you in the Spanish that you were trying to learn, it's time for a quinceañera. Okay. Well, go down to this bakery, and they'll tell you what to order. Okay. It's a huge deal in Mexico. In fact, you see a lot of quinceañeros in the United States. In fact, I was at one of my daughter's gymnastic competitions years ago. And, when you go to those things, that's almost as close as Lutherans get to purgatory, by the way. When you have a big meet, there's like 30 different businesses or, I don't know, gyms that are there. And your daughter's doing her thing for 3 minutes. And you wait for hours. So I'm wandering around. She has to meet with the team, and they're stretching, I'm wandering around. And it was this big kind of a multi-purpose center in Livermore, right in the center of the city. If you've ever been to Livermore, if you've gone to like a big city function, that's where we were. So it's a pretty big complex. And I'm wandering around waiting. And there's a quinceañero there. And it's like, oh, that's kind of cool. So I just kind of stood at the door, watched a little bit. That was kind of neat. But I had no idea what was going on. And Ruth has no idea what's going on. And so her mother-in-law, acting as her mom, says, go here, do this. And she did it. All right, let's go on to our next set of verses. Please read with me. And when Boaz had eaten and drunk, and his heart was merry, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. Then she came softly and uncovered his feet and lay down. At midnight, the man was startled and turned over, and behold, a woman lay at his feet. He said, who are you? And she answered, I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer. By the way, and this is why I don't often use the ESV. How many of you thought to yourselves, you had a nice meal last weekend after church, and you felt merry? We just don't talk like that anymore, do we? He was merry and glad in heart. Okay. Yeah, he was totally lit, dude. Yeah, he was. If anybody drank, that may be true. So that's why I tend to stick with the NIV. It just has a more regular sense of talking. But that's fine. ESV is a good translation. It's better than the NIV in some areas. Okay, so Boaz is probably sleeping on the threshing floor to protect his investment. Now, the commentator pointed out was kind of interesting that Naomi, it's a small town, so everybody knows what's going on. Naomi says that Boaz is going to be threshing the barley harvest. Well, we know that the wheat was harvested after the barley, and at the end of chapter 2, we saw that Ruth gleaned throughout the barley and the wheat harvest. So Boaz he was going to harvest twice, winnow once. So that he kept the barley seed unwinnowed, and that was with the threshing floor and the winnowing fork. If that's how you did it, there were better ways to do it. And being a wealthy man, he probably had a grinder and things like that. But in any case, that's your season's investment. So you can imagine, like Eastern Washington, where I grew up in Western Washington. Eastern Washington, I vacationed there quite a few times. Just miles of wheat fields out there, and you probably have read stories like I have of farmers recognizing that they got to harvest and it's the fall and there's some storms coming. And you get a bunch of water on that grain, and that's a huge problem. And so you got to harvest it at the right time. Otherwise, you could lose your investment, which could break you. And so Boaz, same thing. He may be a wealthy man, but he's still got to get his harvest in. And if he doesn't, all that work, months of growing and making sure it was ready, and then the harvester's going out there and all that stuff could be for nothing if his investment goes bad, if somebody steals it. So Ruth makes a request for marriage. So let's turn to Ezekiel 16. All right, so in Ezekiel 16, we'll look at verse 8. Ezekiel is not a book we read a lot from. It's the revelation of the Old Testament. It's got that same apocalyptic style. In other words, lots of images and metaphors and dreams and visions, and it's difficult for us sometimes to understand. In Ezekiel 16, God is talking to Israel, and Israel's been pretty bad. As you know, in fact, Ezekiel is one of the early exiles away from the land of Israel to Babylon. And so God is scolding Israel, and he speaks of Israel by calling her Jerusalem. He personifies her, and he says, "It was like you were my young bride." Here's what he says in Ezekiel 16:8. "Later I passed by, and when I looked at you and saw that you were old enough for love, I spread the corner of my garment over you and covered your nakedness. I gave you my solemn oath and entered into a covenant with you, declares the sovereign Lord, and you became mine." And so spreading the corner of a garment over someone was a way of symbolizing, I'm going to marry you. Today we do that with a ring, don't we? And so there's a kind of a funny commercial out right now. I don't even remember who it's for, so the commercial's not working. But it's this man and woman, and they're on their first date. Obviously, they're meeting for the first time. And the commercial shows them, going to eat somewhere, and then they end up at a bar and they're singing karaoke, and the guy bends down on one knee, and she's like, no, this is like our first date. And he goes, no, and he's got the mic, he goes, no, just tying my shoe. So it's kind of cute. But in our culture, if, people now try to film it, and then they post it on Facebook right away, because it's a wonderfully private moment, and everyone on Facebook should see that. The man will get down on one knee and he'll hold up a ring, right? And if she accepts the ring and puts it on her finger, so that's our symbol for engagement in marriage. So to us, it might sound funny to say, well, spread the corner of your garment over me. But that's just how they did it. I mean, back then, people might think, well, what are you getting on one knee for? You're the man, or whatever. I don't know. But that's how they made a proposal. And so Ruth comes and she proposes to Boaz. And that was very, very unusual. Generally speaking, marriages in that culture were arranged. Not always, but so the parents, two sets of parents would get together and say, hey, I think we can see our kids like each other a lot, so, let's do this. And sometimes it wasn't that good. Sometimes it was, you're going to marry this person. Yeah. Now, we rebel at that, don't we? no one has the right to do that. That's our culture. That's our culture. But the way we've done it has worked really well, hasn't it? Think about that. I remember watching a movie. Beth and I watched this romantic movie. I took one for the team, guys. I kind of watched a Lifetime style movie. It's like, wow. Okay, honey, we can watch. And it was this movie of this guy. He's a businessman, and he goes to the country of India. Well, he falls in love with this young woman. They fall in love, and et cetera, et cetera. But then he goes home after his year there or however long he's there, and she says, well, I can't go with you. I'm to be married to so and so. And of course, the reaction of all the Americans was, oh, that's awful. You should marry for love. So, and that's not wrong entirely. But, what's the divorce rate in India, I wonder, compared to the United States? So, it's very easy to become culturally arrogant and assume that everyone thinks like us and everyone should behave like us because we've got it right, obviously. But the divorce rate in the United States would tell us maybe we don't have it as right as we think we do.
I got a question.
Yes?
But doesn't the church allow divorces too?
According to Jesus' words it's Matthew and Mark where he talks about unfaithfulness. And then Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 7, I believe, where he also says abandonment or desertion can be grounds for divorce. So biblically, there's 2 grounds for divorce. So yes, the church will allow for divorce in those 2 circumstances. And unfortunately, we live in a messy world. By the way, in Matthew 19 and Mark, I don't remember the chapter, but I remember it's Matthew 19. Jesus is talking to the Pharisees, and they say, well, Moses commanded us, so we just get a certificate, we hand it to the woman, and we're done. And Jesus says, Moses permitted you. He changes the vocabulary there. He says, Moses permitted you because your hearts were hard, but it was not this way from the beginning. And then he quotes Genesis. The 2 become one. What God has joined together, let no one separate. That's Jesus talking there. That's where that phrase comes from in our wedding service. What God has joined together, let no one separate. Yeah, marriage is hard because we're sinners and we live in a sinful world. So that's why we really need the Lord. Okay, so Ruth makes a marriage request. Our next set of questions here. A Levirate marriage is described in Deuteronomy 25, 5-10. So let's take a look at that. Deuteronomy 25, 5-10. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Yep, it's on your study guide and it's also on the screen. So if you're looking for what chapter, it's on the study guide and it's on the screen. Deuteronomy 25, 5-10. So this is that marriage that happens when someone dies. If brothers are living together and one of them dies without a son, his widow must not marry outside the family. Her husband's brother shall take her and marry her and fulfill the duty of a brother-in-law to her. The first son she bears shall carry on the name of the dead brother, so that his name will not be blotted out from Israel. However, if a man does not want to marry his brother's wife, she shall go to the elders at the town gate and say, my husband's brother refuses to carry on his brother's name in Israel. He will not fulfill the duty of a brother-in-law to me. Then the elders of the town shall summon him and talk to him. If he persists in saying, I don't want to marry her, his brother's widow shall go up to him in the presence of the elders, take off one of his sandals, spit in his face, and say, this is what is done to the man who will not build up his brother's family line. That man's line shall be known in Israel as the family of the unsandaled. That's beautiful, isn't it? The family of the unsandaled. So again, this sounds very, very strange to us, and it is strange to us. But you have to remember that in the ancient world, there were no 401ks, IRAs, Social Security. For you to lose your husband could be a disaster. Now, it's not that women didn't work. They did. But if you've got kids to raise, how are you going to raise the kids and work? Because pretty much all the other women are working too. And there might be some older women who would help you out, but still, I mean, how do you do that? And when you get very old, who's going to care for you in your old age? We talk a lot about the responsibility. I would never want my kids to have to do that for me. That's what we say. That's the exact opposite of the biblical culture. In the biblical culture, that was exactly what your kids would do for you. They would care for you in your old age, and everybody knew it. Think about the fourth commandment. So we got 9 commandments, 10 words. I'll talk about that in Fit for Life, and yes, you're invited to come. I'll start in about a month and a half. But in the nine words, or in the 9 commandments, in the 10 words, one of them is honor your father and mother. Now, we can see how you'd make the top 10, right? Don't kill, that's really important. Don't commit adultery, makes sense. Have no other gods, yeah. Remember the Sabbath day, don't forget to worship God, yeah, that's important. So we can see those in the top 10, but honor your father and mother? I mean, really? Is that really in the top 10? Well, God thinks it is. You suppose he meant that? He did. And so why? Well, think about it this way. Let's just throw out, I don't know what the average lifespan is, but let's pretend it's 80. For the first 20 years of your life, who takes care of you? Your parents do. From ages 20 to 40, who do you take care of? Your children. Thank you. From 40 to 60, who do you take care of? Your aging parents. And when you're 60 to 80, who takes care of you? Your kids. And so God has designed us so that we will care for each other through every stage of our life. And because we have just absolutely obliterated family in our culture. Family is whatever you want, whenever you want. And if you want to leave, you just leave. It's okay. And we make ourselves financially independent, so we don't need anybody. Is that really the better way? I mean, I think there's a good case to be made for saving money and so forth. But look what's come along with that. So I saw a hand over here at this table. Linda, did you have your hand in?
I just was going to ask, what happens if the brother-in-law is married?
That's the only case where you would see in the Bible that you have more than one wife. Yeah.
So they own.
Yeah, that's the only case in the Bible. Now, there are other cases where you see that, but it's the only case in the Bible where that's prescribed. For example, for Jacob, he had Leah and Rachel and a couple of concubines as well. That's never commanded by God. In fact, God told the kings of Israel not to marry foreign women, and they did anyways. So this is the only case because that was the welfare system. So, now that that's gone by the wayside, one man, one woman for life. So all those civil laws and political laws of Israel were part of the Old Covenant. We live under the New Covenant. Good, that's right. And so we don't take more than one wife, biblically. And people who point to the Old Testament say, well, you can have more than one wife. There's certain segments of Mormonism that continue to do that this day. They're forgetting that the New Covenant supersedes the Old, right? So is it necessary to circumcise your baby boys? Ooh, not a lot of confidence there. No, it's not. Read the book of Galatians. It is not necessary to circumcise your baby boys for religious purposes. If you want to do it for health reasons, fine. But there's no Christian reason to circumcise your baby boys. By the way, I kept the article. I have an old magazine from Promise Keepers, and the head layperson of Promise Keepers, back in the 90s, I think, he wrote a whole article about, this was really tough for me to do. I had to take my son to the doctor, and they circumcised me. He cried. It was horrible to watch, and to be there, my poor son. He said, but I just know God's command. I was like, dude, have you read the New Testament? Unnecessary theologically. Hello? And that's why the Lord's Supper. That's why we don't celebrate the Passover as Christians. We can have a Christian Passover meal to remember what it meant and see how Christ fulfills it. But we don't do that. Baptism replaces circumcision. The Lord's Supper replaces the Passover. Lori.
The Jewish culture still does do circumcision.
Yep,
right?
They sure do. Yep.
So Judaism and Muslims too?
I don't think Muslims are circumcised. Anybody here know? I'm not sure. Yeah, I don't think they do circumcision. I think they see that as a Jewish thing and would abhor it.
So is Judaism the same as Jewish?
Yes. So if you hear someone today say, oh, that guy's a Jew, then if he practices a religion, of course not all ethnic Jews do, then if he follows it would be Judaism. But what makes this all the more interesting, we can have a whole whole other Bible class on this. Judaism is not the religion of the Old Testament. You know, think about where's the temple? Where's the sacrificial system? Where's the high priest? They don't have any of that. And so Judaism is not the religion of the Old Testament.
Why is it lumped together with Muslim and Christianity?
Because people who think they know a lot about religion, you know, professors and the like, say, well, they're monotheistic. They all worship one God. And they all teach that you should be a good person. Right? Well, religion might teach that, but Christianity, well, Christianity says you should try and live a good life. But those people who study religion say to earn God's favor, to go to heaven, you have to be a good person. And they're all the same. Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. And it's so false. You know, anybody who really studies religion knows that Christianity, Islam, and Judaism are very distinct religions. They've got massive differences in salvation, who Jesus is, who God is, what the purpose of good works is. For the Christian, good works are the response lived out of grace as a new person. They have nothing to do with earning a place in eternity or whatever. For the Muslim, good works absolutely propel you into Muslim heaven. And for the Jew, you know, I think there's some uncertainty about that. So, yeah. Really interesting stuff. Okay, so we read about levirate marriage here. So, and by the way, notice that you go to the town gate for this stuff. If the guy won't marry his sister-in-law, you go to the town gate and you go to the elders, and that's where legal decisions are made. Now, I want you to remember that. That's all I'm going to say about it today, because in chapter 4, that's where Boaz goes. He wants to have a legal decision made with the elders at the town gate. So we might go to the courthouse. In many, in the ancient culture of the Old Testament, you would go to the town gate. That's where the elders sat, because that's where people went in and out. And maybe there was a commercial, a retail argument about the price of something. Well, you know, the customers would come in the gate and then go back out, and so that's where you'd take your dispute to the city gate. So I want you to remember now that being a redeemer was different than this levirate marriage. See, levirate marriage was the brother of the dead guy supposed to marry the wife, the widow. This is not Boaz. If that were the case, first of all, he's not Elimelech's brother. It's never mentioned in Ruth. Secondly, if that were the case, he would marry whom? Naomi, that's right. And that never comes into play. And so what we'll see, especially next week, but I'll just give you a hint today, Boaz is going above and beyond what he needs to do. And he's being asked to go above and beyond by Ruth. And that's what makes this really, really fascinating. So the Redeemer was focused on redeeming kin from difficulty or danger. So there's 4 uses of this word that are used. This word Redeemer. Let's see if I can find my notes here. And the 4 basic situations. And the big one was repurchasing of a field that was sold during times of financial hardship. So as I mentioned in the sermon very briefly this morning, the land of Israel was Yahweh's land, but he portioned it out to the tribes. You get some tribe of Judah, you get some tribe of Benjamin, you get some tribe of Simeon, and so on. But you were never allowed to permanently sell it. You could sell it, so I could sell it to Joan, but really what I was doing is if I would release it out for her for a while. And every 50 years, those of you who went to our Wednesday services in Advent, the last one, remember we talked about the year of Jubilee? Just nod your head, make me feel good that you remember that. Okay. So the year of Jubilee happened every 50 years. Slaves were freed, debts were canceled, and the land would go back to its ancestral heirs. And so the land would go back to the people. God said, this tribe, you get that land. And so if you loaned out land, you leased it out. They couldn't have it forever. It had to go back to Joan. If I leased it out from Joan, it would have to go back to her in that 50th year of Jubilee and celebration. And so the Redeemer's job was, well, maybe we're still 15 years away from then. And it's like, man, you know, and Joan's hurting. She needs the land back because she needs to farm it. As a redeemer, then a relative, I could come alongside if I were wealthy and say, let me pay the rest of the price on that lease to the person who borrowed it. and then you get your land back. Now, you don't have to wait for the year of Jubilee. So that was one of the main uses or main purposes of the Redeemer. Another one, let's see. The other one was that you would redeem your children back from the Lord. Remember, the Lord said the firstborn of every family is mine, because when you left Egypt, I killed the firstborn of Egypt. A third one, here's a fun one, that the Redeemer would be the avenger of blood. So let's say someone murdered my brother. I, as Redeemer, would go kill them. It was part of the legal system. Yeah, weird, huh? And so they could flee to a city of refuge, and then the elders of that city would hear the case, and if they felt the case was valid, then I would kill the person. I would not murder them. I would execute them. It's different. And then the fourth use of the word is of God redeeming his people, buying them back. So that's what redeemers did. And so when Ruth says, spread the corner of your garment over me, she's saying, marry me, and then you're a redeemer. So I've got redeeming work for you. Land. You need to buy some land. And we'll learn in chapter 4 that the land belongs to Naomi, but she can't farm it. She can't till it. She needs someone to rescue her. And so Ruth is asking for help from Boaz, both for herself and for Naomi. All right, let's go to verses 10 and 11. Let's read together. And he said, may you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have made this last kindness greater than the first, and that you have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich. And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you ask. For all my fellow townsmen know that you are a woman, a worthy woman. Sorry.
The actions.
Okay, that's not in the Bible. So I wrote that so you can read out loud if you want. All right, so the actions of Ruth and Boaz flowed out of their relationship with the Lord. A really great word here that he uses. He says, this last kindness. And that's that word, chesed. Remember, I've shared that word with you before. It can be spelled Chesed in English. And basically, the old King James had a pretty good translation. It was called loving kindness. And a really fairly close equivalent in the New Testament is kind of our idea of grace. This undeserved favor, this kindness that God shows to people and that people and the Lord show each other. So it's really, really interesting. Now, let's compare chapter 3:11 with 2 verse 1. So we just read 3:11. It said, everyone knows, Ruth, that you're a woman who has a worthy character, or a worthy woman. Would someone please turn to chapter 2 verse 1? 2 verse 1. What does it say about Boaz in 2 verse 1? Man of standing. Any other word? How is Boaz described there? Different translation?
Influential.
Influential. So this is 2:1. Anybody else?
A relative.
Okay. Someone just read the whole verse for me, please. 2 verse 1. Candy, go for it.
Now Naomi had a relative on her husband's side, a man of standing from the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz.
Okay, man of standing. So this is the same Hebrew word here. It's usually translated to be strong. We talked about this in 2 verse 1. It's the same exact word that's applied to Ruth. So worthy is a great term there. They're both strong of character. Today we would say, that's really, it's a generic word, but we said, he's a good guy. We'd say that. Or, my mom used to say something like, she really has strength of character. And I think that's maybe the best phrase of all, both for Ruth and Boaz, strength of character. Have you known a couple whose marriage was a clear witness to God? Anybody care to describe that couple? You don't even have to use their names. What was it about their marriage that was a clear witness to God?
Committed.
They were committed to each other? They helped others. Yeah, that was the word. I'm thinking of a marriage. People are with the Lord now, but they were members of this church. Now they're members of the eternal congregation. But they served people. They just served and served and served. They served each other and they served other people. It was beautiful. see. So Matthew 5:16, let your light shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. That's Matthew 5:16. 1 Peter 2:12 says much the same thing, but I'm going to move on because we have about 15 minutes. I know. The time goes fast. So, look ahead in your Bible. What does Boaz say is the purpose of his marrying Ruth in chapter 4, verse 10? And how do you feel about that? So let's take a look at Ruth 4, verse 10.
Skipping ahead.
We are skipping ahead, yeah. Boaz says, I have also acquired Ruth the Moabitess, Mahlon's widow, as my wife, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property, so that his name will not disappear from among his family or from the town records. Today you are witnesses. So that's that. He's acting in a way as a levirate marriage, even though he's not required to do so. But what does he say his purpose is? Maintain the name, maintain the family. Doesn't say anything about Ruth, does he? Other than I'm marrying her so I can do this. So how do you feel about that? You have your hand up, Joe?
Oh, I was going to ask a different question.
Okay, let me come back to you.
But she requested it.
She did. And why did she request it?
Because her mother-in-law.
Her mother-in-law had need. Okay. Paula?
Well, as you said in your sermon, it goes against what our culture says. We marry for romantic love.
Mm-hmm.
So this seems very foreign to us. It feels uncomfortable. It's like he's just marrying to keep the family name, not because he loves Ruth.
We're going to meet some needs here with this marriage.
Yeah.
Yay. Right? That's kind of how we are. Now, romantic love is a good and important part of marriage. Don't hear me wrong. It's important. And we need to rekindle that over the years of a marriage. But that's not the only purpose for marriage biblically. And that's kind of the only purpose in our culture. Joan.
So if he marries Ruth and they have a son, that son will be his brother's line. And then if there's a second son born, will it be his line?
That's a great question, and the book of Ruth doesn't tell us the answer to
And
that.
you don't know what the custom was.
No, and I don't know what happened there. We will hear about the son born in chapter 4. There is going to be a son born, but we're not told about other, what they did with that. But yeah, and there's a risk involved for Boaz, which we'll talk about next week. Not today. It's interesting. All right, let's go on and read verses 12 to 15. Wait, my slide didn't catch up to me here. My remote went, but my slide did not. One moment, please. And still not working.
Can I advance it?
Yeah, so what you'll have to do.
If you lose focus on OBS, it won't like that very much. There we are. So yeah, you'll just have to advance it like that and then go back to OBS to change camera angles. What was this one? What was this app?
Oh, it's the green one.
The green one, okay.
Yeah. Yep.
Got it.
Huh, now my phone says slide change error. No kidding. Thank you. I see that. All right, so let's read here verses 12 and 15. And Brian is going to have to advance the slides here. I'm guessing let me just test it here real quick. Oh, it's working now. Okay. You didn't do that, did you?
Nope.
Okay, so hopefully it's going to work. Let's read together. And now it is true that I am a redeemer, yet there is a redeemer nearer than I. Remain tonight, and in the morning, if he will redeem you, good, let him do it. But if he is not willing to redeem you, then as the Lord lives, I will redeem you. Lie down until the morning. So she lay at his feet until the morning, but arose before one could recognize another. And he said, let it not be known that the woman came to the threshing floor. And he said, bring the garment you are wearing and hold it out. So she held it, and he measured out 6 measures of barley and put it on her. And she went into the city. All right. So Boaz here, what I love about this, he trusts the Lord to do what is best for Ruth. He's going to say, all right, this is crazy, but I'll do it. I'll do all that you ask. And so why do you think it's difficult for us, people, or maybe even yourself, to place your personal life under God's control? Becky?
Sin.
Well, yes, it's sin.
We have our own selfish wants. We know what we like, and
Right.
this is doing God's will.
Okay, so let's delve into that a little bit. When you're young and you're 21 or 24 or 19 and you're dating, why is it so hard to let God be in control of that? Lori? Okay, yeah. Let's dive down a little bit more. Okay. Yes, but what's underneath that?
You got a lot of emotion.
Why? Let me ask it this way. Why don't we want our parents involved?
Because they know what you're doing.
Let's do it our way. Our flesh takes over.
Whoops.
It's ruled by sin.
And why do we want to do it our way? I know it's already been said we're selfish, but what's
Free will.
We want to be
okay?
God.
All right, so I'm just going to tell you what I want you to say. Okay. It's because we're afraid, deep down, I think, that somebody else will get it wrong. I mean, this is important. Who am I going to marry? That's important. Am I selfish? Sinful nature. You're all right. It's about selfishness. But in this sense, I think my mom or dad might want me to date this girl. I don't like her. It's wrong. Right? It's not a good fit for me. And that may be true. But there's that fear of what if I marry the wrong person? And then, so that's part of the other part is just blindness, right? You become so emotionally attached to this person. I remember years ago working with a young man who will remain unnamed. Not anybody in my family, but someone who's actually here at our church and is not anymore. Absolutely the wrong person. Totally wrong. And he could not see it. And so we had a rather lengthy conversation. He got pretty angry at me. And then about 2 or 3 months later, well, it was longer than that, 6 months later, finally figured it out. But it would have been a disaster, unmitigated disaster. They were so far apart. But we want to be in control because we're the ones who should know best, right? Because it's my heart, it's my life. No one has the right to tell me how to live.
Doesn't God have patience with us in that kind of situation?
Oh, more patience than we deserve. Yeah, thank the Lord for that. Because I look back and I go, I was such an idiot then. I was a young idiot. Now I'm just an old idiot. Just the stupid things I would do. It's like, oh. And no, I'm not going to tell you any of them. So, just horrible. Just horrible. So this is really an act of faith. So, I would encourage you to talk with your kids about this if you have one of your grandkids. To think about, will I let God in my personal life? Because he doesn't get a lot of access often. Because it's really important to us. And isn't that silly? Something so important to us, we don't want God involved. It's backwards, isn't it? Note that in verse 13, Boaz makes a commitment in the context of his relationship with Yahweh. As the Lord lives, we hear that kind of language throughout the text. It's pretty neat to see. Boaz did not wish to endanger Ruth's reputation in case the other man would wish to marry her. Isn't that hard, right? Because we want this to be a lifetime love story, right? And he gives her barley when she leaves. I mean, he didn't have flowers. He had to give her something, right? And this is a beautiful love story. But what does he say? Well, if the other guy will do it, that's okay. What? No. You should say, I'm going to go and fight for you. And Ruth, I'll be there for you. To the end of time, I love you more than ice cream. But he says, no, I'll go. And if he redeems, he says, good. But if not, I'll do it. Come on. Right? We don't like that, but that's really a much more solid footing. I mean, we think about, well, those old-fashioned values my parents like, if he can't support you, he shouldn't marry you. That's just stupid. Is it?
Yeah.
If he doesn't have a job, and you don't have a job, is that a good time to get married? Probably not. Because it's going to bring incredible stress and anxiety into your family, and you'll be depending on both sets of parents, which isn't healthy for a marriage. Oh, I didn't think about that. No. By the way, I've got this great slide in one of my PowerPoints for a Bible class. I can't remember which one it is, but it's a picture of a person's brain who's on drugs and a person's brain who's in love, and they're nearly indistinguishable. In other words, this is why we make really bad decisions. Okay. Do you have any brownies? That's kind of where we're at. And so that's why having good friends that will tell you the truth, not just what you want to hear. If you're young and thinking about marrying somebody, talk to you. If you have good friends who will be honest with you, and yeah, I know it's hard, you got to talk to mom and dad. Say, hey, we're getting serious. And then if they say, let's go to the hospital or you're having an MRI done, then you know what they're thinking there. Now, endangering Ruth's reputation. Don't let it be known that a woman was down at the threshing floor. Why would Boaz say that if they didn't have sex? And I don't believe they did. Because in Canaanite fertility religions, you had a couple places you could go to have sex with cultic prostitutes. One was the high places. So if you've ever wondered when you're reading your Bible and God says, this king was pretty good, but he wasn't good in that he allowed the high places to remain. That's why. Because you go up on top of a hill, and that's, I guess, closer to Baal, because he was considered to be the god of the heavens. Asherah was considered to be god of the earth. When it rained, Baal was inseminating Asherah. It was very sexual. And so you go to a shrine on the top of a hill, and if you had sex there, that might encourage Baal to rain, because we got to get this drought over with. So that was one place. The Canaanite religions were fertility religions, all about your crops and your animals. You want lots of animals, lots of crops, lots of rain. That's where the wealth comes from. Baal and Asherah can give it to us, but we have to encourage them. And so they mingled religion and sex. It was just an addictive mixture for the people of Israel. They failed miserably. And so the threshing floor was another one of those places. And there would be sexual liaisons among the Canaanites on the threshing floors. Because all the grain's there. It's fertility, right? We're thanking Baal or thanking Asherah. And so that's why there's this tension in chapter 3 that we Americans are completely oblivious to. Naomi tells Ruth, get dressed, go at night to the threshing floor. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge, know what I mean? That's what the Canaanites would think. There's going to be some sexual goings on here. Also, it says uncover his feet. Did you see this in an adult Bible class? I can't say this with my junior high confirmants I used to have. The word foot in Hebrew was sometimes used as a euphemism for male genitals. We don't say the word, we say feet, right? And so there's all this sexual tension in this story. For a Canaanite, going to the threshing floor and uncovering his feet, we know exactly what that means. And so that's why some commentators have looked at this and thought, well, did they just have a sexual intercourse? But what's very interesting, and one of the commentaries I read spent quite a bit of time with this, they pointed out that it doesn't literally say uncover his feet. It says uncover the place around his feet. Now that may seem to be a tiny little thing, but when it's used literally, then it literally does mean the feet, or it could be the genitals. But here it's the same kind of phrase that means uncover the area around the head. And so the Hebrew language here is saying it could be interpreted this way because that's the culture, but I want to highlight how Boaz and Ruth are different than the culture. And don't we see that throughout the book? And like I said in the sermon, to me that's probably the main thing in the text is the character of Ruth and Boaz. They always do the hard thing, even when it hurts, even when it's hard. And they do that here. Okay, let's go on to verses 16 through 18. Let's read. When Ruth came to her mother-in-law, Naomi asked, "How did it go, my daughter?" Then she told her everything Boaz had done for her and added, "He gave me these 6 measures of barley, saying, 'Don't go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed.'" Then Naomi said, "Wait, my daughter, until you find out what happens. for the man will not rest until the matter is settled today. Okay, so let's compare Ruth 1:21 with what we just read in 3:17. Don't go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed. Ruth 1:21. Somebody read that, please, nice and loud.
I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty.
Okay, that's good. So Naomi, this is in her bitter stage. She says, I went away full, and the Lord brought me back empty. And Boaz says, you shouldn't go back to your mother-in-law empty. Same word. And so that's not Boaz doing a wordplay. That's the author of the letter, or this book of Hebrews, noting what Boaz did. Naomi is being filled up. She starts empty in chapter 1, and all throughout the book, she's being filled up. And we'll see the culmination of that in chapter 4. That's pretty neat. All right, and then they just end by saying, hey, well, let's watch and see what happens, because it's already morning, and chapter 4 is going to be that next day, and we'll read about that next week. So, some concluding thoughts. What similarities and what differences do you find between the reasons to get married in our society and biblical reasons for marriage? Sue.
I think now we do it for our own enjoyment, love, but I think there was a desire to perpetuate the faith back then. Yes.
Yeah, you would marry someone to perpetuate your faith in Yahweh, or in the New Testament, in Christ. And it used to be that way in our culture. I mean, people make fun today. I've heard people joke, used to be, like my mom said, never marry a Catholic. Well, there's nothing wrong with Roman Catholic Christians. But what we're implying is, the differences just don't matter. Just marry whoever you want. And I'm not sure that's a good thing. In fact, it's not a good thing. Because now it's come to the place where it doesn't even matter if you marry a believer. Well, he's not a believer, Mom, but he's a really nice guy, and I'll work on him, maybe, if I think about it, sometime. And it doesn't happen. It rarely happens. What happens more often is the believer is pulled out of the church by the unbelieving spouse. Now, another thing, what this says about marriage is that the biblical purposes for marriage are many, but there's three main ones. Number one is for mutual joy and companionship between husband and wife. Number two, for the procreation of children. And number three, for the protection against sexual temptation. Those are the big three reasons in the Bible. Think about what that says. I can't remember the name of the book. I have it in my office. It was written after the Supreme Court said that the benefits of marriage should extend to same-sex couples as well. And what one of the justices wrote in there, and the author quotes this in his book, he said, the justice said, who are we to say that someone, I wish I should remember the exact language, I don't, I'm sorry. But it's either someone should not be loved or experience love, something like that. And if you think about that statement, what is he saying? So you can't experience love any other way? And that if you're not married, you're going to be unloved and lonely all your life? Is that what we're saying here? And so marriage has become, with that Supreme Court decision, a relationship primarily about emotions and how loved you feel and how happy you are. And that's pretty much, I think, the way most Americans feel about it. But notice the Bible says, no, it's a man and a woman for life, for joy, yes, but for the procreation of children and protection against sexual temptation. And the sexual drive is incredibly strong. We all know that, right? I mean, look what's happened with the priesthood and with nuns in Roman Catholicism. It's just brutal. You can't bottle that up. I mean, it's just brutal. And so the Bible is very honest and open about that. And then here's what marriage is. And if we make it just about a loving feeling, then I can go somewhere else and somewhere else and someone else, and same gender, opposite gender, doesn't matter. You hear what I'm saying? Right. So these biblical reasons for marriage are not just right; they're good and healthy and sometimes life-saving. When you think about the number of sexually transmitted diseases that are going around now. So, and then last thing, I'm not going to let you answer the question because I got to go. I got 11 minutes before the next service starts. But why do you think the Bible calls the church the bride of Christ? I mean, think about that. Just take that question, maybe talk about it at lunch today. Why does the Bible call the church the bride of Christ? Father, we thank you for your love for us.